thank you, Rob. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you for your leadership at ITIF, for once again being kind of ahead of the curve on a subject of great importance. Rob and I actually first got to know each other, what, it was a decade ago, more than 15 years ago, when we were doing technology-related issues for the PPI, and to see how that has morphed into ITIF and this kind of broad bipartisan approach that is so missing on so many of the issues that we faced. I have to say, Rob gave me that great introduction about being this, very cutting-edge guy around broadband, around mobile technology. I have to tell you, if I really was truly still cutting edge, I would have had broadband technology that would have told me that the 12th Street Tunnel was a pain in the ass this morning. I might have gotten here on time. And I also realized that, and I say this, Neetha, will you raise your hand? Neetha is on my staff, but she truly is still cutting edge. I have to fully acknowledge, in front of this group at least, that I used to be really cutting edge in terms of mobile communications and broadband. I was so cutting edge, but when I was cutting edge, actually, I know you were having Paul Jacobs for our lunch speaker today. I was cutting edge when his dad, Irving Jacobs, was just starting Qualcomm back in the early 80s, or when Motorola's breakthrough cell phone was still that brick. Remember the brick cell phones? Those of us who were old enough in the room here. So the fact that I am a little dated on all of the issues that we're going to talk about today still puts me ahead of most of my colleagues. It says that this field is moving extraordinarily quickly. And I'm very excited about it because, as I've, in the 18 months I've been senator, the area that I've probably dug in the deepest has not been in telecom, but it really was on the banking committee digging into the whole question about financial reform. And one of the things that has become evident to me, and why this and other tech-related forums and trying to get tech policy, I think, is so right and so important right now, really goes back to at least a thesis that I have. Be curious to see response from the audience, whether they would agree or not. That as I got into the financial reform and kind of peeled back the onion a little bit, and fully started to appreciate how close not only America but the whole world's financial system came to total collapse in 2008 and 2009, scared the dickens out of me. And it also became more and more evident to me as we kind of find our ways trying to sort through digging out of this economic catastrophe, that really for the last decade, we haven't done very much innovation and growth in our economy, kind of on a macro level. It is nowhere approaching what happened in the 90s and the late 80s, when wireless and IT, as some of the numbers that Rob cited, really took an economy at that point, was an American economy at that point that was still being kind of written off in the macro sense. Remember when the Japanese were going to eat our lunch and we were never going to come back, and because of innovation, because of technology growth, we kind of leapt far ahead. Clearly in the last decade, there are exceptions, the Googles and the Facebooks. But if we look kind of broadly, I would argue the last decade we've had an economy that has been driven mostly by an overheated real estate market. And then we had a morphing of where all the brightest young men and women in our economy, as opposed to going into the tech field or going into the VC field, went to Wall Street and became financial engineers. And under the guise of creating products that we'd never heard of before, that were supposed to be about lowering the overall cost of risk, really created a financial house of cards that, when it started to unwind, almost brought the whole system down. And perhaps with fits and starts, we've put a new framework around that, and I think it means a giant calling out, not just around mobile broadband, but across the board of how we jumpstart an innovation and growth agenda. It ought to be a place where we could find some bipartisan consensus that is, we not only simply climb out of this deep recession, kind of government's used most of its tools, monetary policy and stimulus it can use. What we're really going to have to do longer term is put in place an innovation and growth agenda. And one area where I think there is enormous opportunity, and a real opportunity for American leadership again, is within mobile broadband. And I know you're going to hear from, later today, the South Korean ambassador. I think we will find, I know the FCC's recent report is, while we have a chance to be a leader, we really, unlike where we started with traditional mobile mobility in the 80s and then IT in the 90s, where America actually started with a relatively level playing field vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Right now, we start behind many other parts of the rest of the world. And trying to get the policies right to allow a robust, competitive, private sector-driven innovation in mobile broadband is very important. I mean, one of the things that I was interested to see is that, that while we saw between 2008 and 2009 a literally doubling of projected overall use of mobile data, you know, we're going to continue to see maybe not those doubling rates, but over the next decade, growth between 40 and 100% a year. That equates very much to the original kind of wired internet growth in the 90s, or some of the traditional mobile growth in the late 80s and early 90s. So we've got two models of this kind of enormously expansive growth that I think can be the model we'll see in mobile broadband. So how do we make sure we get it right? Being a good politician, let me first of all claim two small pieces of legislation that I'm working on, or that I proposed with both of them with the Republican co-sponsors, that will incrementally help. One of the things that is going to drive the expansion opportunities within mobile broadband, comes back to the early days of why we needed to create Nextcloud abroad, to kind of piggyback on top of the original cellular allocations, and that is spectrum. Until we can get more spectrum, until we can shorten the process of trying to identify and then get that spectrum into the marketplace, we are going to have this bottleneck on a policy basis. Our office is, this is one of, again, the things that as I kind of get used to working inside the beast of the federal government has been enlightening to me, perhaps in terms of seeing how slow the process is. But Senator Wicker and I from Mississippi put together basically a spectrum reallocation bill about a year ago that seemed like it would be kind of low-hanging fruit. Why couldn't we do an assessment of all the unused government-based spectrum? And then we tried to push a little bit further than that, not just unused, but underutilized. A whole lot of spectrum that's been allocated 10, 20, 30 years out there that's sitting, well, not totally fallow with very low utilization rates. Do this assessment and then come back with a plan on how we can get the unused or underutilized spectrum, recognizing there are certain areas within DoD and for intelligence purposes that we have to be very circumspect about, but to try to get that process started so that we can at least know what our inventory would be. That has, well, broadly bipartisan, and everybody agrees, getting it from here to actually getting it passed through the House and through the Senate, we are still kind of close, and would love anybody's help in this room on kind of getting it across the finish line. But we got to find out first and foremost what is out there, and how we can then incent the private sector to help put additional pressure on not only the FCC, but then the appropriate government agencies to be willing and put the appropriate incentives so that if there needs to be relocation, that some of the government entities that have to give up some of this public spectrum will get something back. I think we need to rethink our spectrum allocation mindset so that it's not simply taking for nothing for a auction that simply replenishes the public till, but I'm very much in favor of some of the ideas that are coming out of Chairman Janikowski's office and others about how we can incent existing incumbents to get a little piece of the pie if they're going to lose some existing spectrum, if it can then be put to higher use. But this spectrum inventory bill is an important step in that direction. A second area, and this is one where actually the other lead sponsor at this point is somebody who's a leader in this space over on the House side, Congressman Harmon, where he said, when we had a letter in the New York Times earlier on Saturday, on the anniversary of September 11th, it is still fairly remarkable that 9 years after 9/11, and one of the outgrowths of that terrible tragedy was when we realized that within the public safety community we had inoperability between various mobile devices, that here we are 9 years later and we're still talking about that. This is not a technology issue. This is a policy issue, and it is candidly also kind of a not invented here form. One of the things I knew even before I got to Congress was that it's a heck of a lot easier to get Democrats and Republicans to agree than it is to get mobile engineers to agree on which type of standards and common equipment they ought to use. We've got a little bill that would put in place the ability, recognizing that the public safety universe, while critically important, is never going to have enough volume to create products that will stay current with the commercial marketplace, that puts some incentives in place so that within the public safety realm, we can create products that can have both public safety applicability and commercial applicability. Now, clearly there are security issues around this. There's got to be preeminence issues. This kind of morphs into some of the old style issues also around spectrum allocation, the old de-auction battle of a few years back. But getting this right in public safety, and I for one still believe that at the end of the day, unless we can keep public safety kind of commensurate with innovation in the innovation within the commercial sphere, public safety will always be the tail on the dog, and we've got to find a way to kind of get public safety synced with the commercial applicability piece, and this legislation may be a step in that direction. One of the ways, if we get all this right, and I want to make two other brief comments, and then I told Rob I didn't have a full formal presentation. Turn the floor open to questions, and any hard ones I'll pump to Rob or Nika. I know one of the issues that we've got right now is pricing. How in mobile broadband are we going to get pricing right? Obviously, we should expect to pay more for higher usage. But I also think it's important that we put in place an expectation that pricing plans will continue to evolve as increased capacity evolves. Some of the pricing plans right now, if you've got a 1 megabit upstream, that sounds pretty good today. But my hope is a few years from now, that's going to feel pretty slow. And if we lock in pricing plans that don't evolve, then we're not going to have the kind of robust and dynamic market. Obviously, back in my old field and traditional cell phone market, that's evolved a bit. And it's been fairly good at keeping commensurate with increasing usages. But, we're going to need a great deal of sensitivity to get it right so that there's appropriate incentives for the network providers to have the dollar value to build out these networks, but they can't be such static pricing that increased capacity is not then fully appropriated. And then finally, one of the areas, and I know that we've already got some of the emerging issues starting to come up, and this is an area that I hope to get, let me say at the outset, more up to speed, because I was a huge advocate within the healthcare debate that healthcare IT, while not a silver bullet, is a incredibly important piece of kind of getting both healthcare delivery right, avoiding healthcare duplication and error, and taking on one of the pieces in the healthcare debate that where clearly all of us are going to have to come back and revisit in a major way, which is trying to get pricing right and trying to do cost containment in a much broader way. And healthcare IT will be, I think, a valuable piece of that. How we get, particularly on the rural piece, healthcare IT right, and I know we've already got some disparity between one of the bigger providers, Verizon, and the hospitals, and we as policymakers got to try to sort through that, how we don't totally undercut the private providers, but at the same time, if there are public dollars, to try to kind of nudge the private providers into kind of more aggressive deployment in terms of rural healthcare IT, we've got to get it right. I will recall there will be some in this room who are good friends from some of the incumbent providers. When I was governor, in some of the rural communities where the incumbents were continuing to say, yes, Governor, we're going to get to you, we're going to get to your rural communities in terms of broadband deployment at some point down the line. It was amazing how much more attention we got when we actually gave some of the local jurisdictions, and particularly some of the local power companies, the ability to actually do broadband deployment as well. It got folks' attention in terms of the incumbent providers to go ahead and serve those rural markets. I think there's some balance that same way with some of the rural healthcare IT funds that we can use to kind of not unduly undermine the private sector investment. And at the end of the day, it's going to be the network providers that get the rural healthcare IT done right. But with some of those dollars that are out there, some of that potential $400 million that we could deploy to help nudge that along, we've got to get that balance right. And again, I hope I can learn more on this subject and be a more active participant on this issue, since most people have got healthcare fatigue at this point. But I have one of the differences, I think, having been a CEO and executive, never been a legislator before, that I may have different from some of my colleagues is most legislators on most every issue feels the battle is over once the bill is passed or not, when in reality is that's just the beginning of the battle. And in no better place is this more evident than in the healthcare battle. I mean, this is still very much a work in progress. It will either be, I don't think it's going to be near as good as some of the advocates, nor do I think it's going to be the end of the world the way some of the opponents have said. But we could really screw it up if we don't do healthcare implementation right. And this is one of the areas on the healthcare IT piece that we hope to get it right. So I'm, again, very appreciative that Rob has asked me to kick this off. This conference is going to be very important. I'm proud to be the Honorary Co-Chair this year of ITIF. I've still got, as somebody who remembers early stage conversations with Irving Jacobs as he started to morph from kind of the academic side to this idea of creating this new company called Qualcomm. He'll show me how cutting edge I used to be. I hope to get a little more cutting edge as these issues kind of play out in the coming weeks and months, and particularly into the next Congress. I hope that you'll be able to look to me as, once again, one of the guys who hopefully gets it in terms of the value of this sector and how we've got to make sure from a policy standpoint we don't get it wrong. So my thanks for having me, and now the floor is open for questions, comments, and suggestions. Thank you all very much. Questions, comments, suggestions, criticisms? Yes, sir.
And we have mics here.
And we got mics.
Maybe I'll just speak loud enough. Senator John Kern with Telecommunications Report. You spoke of the spectrum relocation bill and chances for anything passing through the Senate this year? Small, none?
I remain optimistic.
Anything to add?
Wouldn't you say, Nika? Would we remain, It was passed out of committee unanimously, which I've learned doesn't really mean much. One of those oxymorons like being on the Senate Budget Committee. I remain optimistic. Yes, please.
Hi, Eliza Quick, National Journal. If the spectrum bill relocation
low-hanging fruit? What are the impediments to getting it through Congress? What hasn't it moved yet? What will it take to get it through?
Want to hear about the early cellular days? Original license application process. You were 12. We were trying to, auction off, negotiate cell phone licenses. I got some great stories. There are some questions around the pay-fors. We have, which are minimal. There is some questions about some of the agencies who would be involved in implementing this, whether this, because it's such good policy, they might want to broaden and kind of get some additional resources. For a long time there was concern from both the defense and intelligence community, and I think we've worked through most of those issues. So it really remains making sure that the around pay-fors and around some jockeying within the appropriate telecom agencies inside the administration and making sure the administration, gets fully behind pushing it through. Underline fully. Because it's, again, how do you, without this, without at least assessing what's out there. And I remember the old spectrum charts when I was doing this stuff in the 80s and late 80s and mid 80s. You kind of remembered all this was, and you had all these huge blocks of spectrum. Is that, if you think about now in terms of the amount of usage we have and some of the 800 and 700 megahertz spectrum, how much bang we get for the buck, and then you see some of the really robust, great spectrum that's out there that seems, how can this public use take up this much spectrum? And you realize there's enormous amounts out there there's either not used or dramatically underused. And I think there's been a real reluctance amongst many to kind of have that exposed because people have been squirreling away, public entities have been squirreling away the spectrum forever. And this is a public use. We need to find. We ought to not be afraid. From the public standpoint, we ought to not be afraid of at least bringing transparency to the to this usage. Now, again, there will be everybody kind of nods here on this one. I would love to also see. It's easy to say, let's go ahead and do this evaluation and usage utilization rates within those that are publicly held spectrum. I hope as many of you, since many of you represent the private sector here, I hope as many of you will nod as well when we say, I would also be willing to look at that same utilization rates for that spectrum that's held in private hands. There are a number of entities out there that have, on the private sector side, who've held spectrum and warehoused this spectrum for decades without any kind of evaluation of its usage. And I frankly believe that's something that ought to be the next step as well. I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Kim Hart with Politico. I was curious.
Why got all these press people talking?
Sorry.
Remember, you are the co-host today, Kim. So
I'll be quick for you then. The FCC has said it's moving forward with this plan to release white spaces, unused broadcast spectrum for the private sector to use, which the tech industry has been pushing for a long time. What are your thoughts on that and how to balance that with the needs of the broadcasters and other people who are also trying to use all this spectrum?
Caveat this is funny, is that this is an area where I'm kind of at the macro level. So take this as generic, not Warner proposes, okay? One, I was glad they moved forward with this finally on the white spaces. Because I think I still think there is an opportunity here. This is an area I'd like to be more involved in going forward, for a grand bargain. For a grand bargain with the broadcasters, where they can, where if in future auction process, the incumbents might be able to receive some of the proceeds. And that this can be, and obviously this will take, as we get into, move from white space to kind of some of the holy grail of broadcasters who, as they move to digital, what they're going to do with some of the underutilized spectrum. There ought to be I think there is, again, there is no technological impediment to having resources available to do appropriate relocation that doesn't interfere with broadcasters' ability to continue to provide their valuable public service, to make sure that incumbents who had an incentive to relocate receive share of compensation, where broadcasters could be winners, the public could be winners, and the nation could end up with a great amount of very, very valuable spectrum that could really help us deploy the kind of mobile broadband that would allow us not to kind of look yearningly at Korea. Yes, sir.
Senator Warner, appreciate your leadership with your governor of Virginia on, you mentioned rural healthcare IT, specifically rural telemedicine, to have enough broadband availability to physicians to able to interpret, especially diagnostic imaging across, and there have been some great pilots in Virginia, but can you comment on applying that set of technology across the board, especially in rural parts of the U.S.?
Probably not very accurately, because when we did broadband and telemedicine in Virginia, we were very cutting edge circa 2002, 2003, 2004 in terms of rural broadband deployment through a public-private cooperative called Mid-Atlantic Broadband, and then a series of others, and had great utilization from UVA, Virginia Tech, and some of our EVMS and stuff. But we had enormous unused capacity in our network at that point. So, other than giving you a nice-sounding political answer that I absolutely support having more telehealth opportunities laid out, but you could educate me on kind of the current state of play on how we get that right.
Well, in the FCC broadband plan, there's recommendations.
Right, there's recommendations.
But it hasn't really sort of brought itself out in terms of extra funding, perhaps, to sort of stimulate some more pilots, demonstrations.
Well, there is, I have been, whether it's healthcare IT or even the broadband area, I think they were great policy goals, and I'm glad that we finally put our money where our mouth has been for some time. I do think some of the criticism that has been made by those who oppose the stimulus were perhaps accurate in that they were the good policy goals, but it really wasn't stimulative in terms of it was short-term funding or immediate funding. This has taken a while to work through, and I continue to be concerned both on the broadband standpoint and the close to $30 billion in healthcare IT that it has been very slow to spend out. And some of the public dollars that are there to kind of jumpstart the rural healthcare piece, and I know, again, going back, I saw the filing at the SEC, and I've seen, Verizon and AHA in terms of their different positions. I would hope the commission would, push aggressively to kind of push to see whether we can get a resolution between the parties, or, on this one, I'd even take an imperfect solution over the perfect, because we got to push this out. And again, I'd be happy to learn more. And again, let me acknowledge, I'd be happy to learn more about, how I could play a more effective role in that conversation.
Time for one more.
One more?
Hi, I'm Adam Hunter, Communications The other bill you mentioned was public safety devices. I'm just curious, what would it take to get that bill done by the end of the year, and might that be less politically controversial than the other public safety bills out there that all deal with unblock?
Well, one thing it might take is a sense of urgency from Congress that while these issues may not be high profile, they really are at least small building blocks of trying to have an innovation and growth agenda for the next decade. And there is nothing partisan about these kind of issues. I think the challenge on the public safety bill is more kind of intramural within the industry. Certain equipment manufacturers have dominated the public safety device market, and it's been a lucrative market. But if we're going to really have public safety interoperability, to try to continue to have public safety as this kind of isolated island, to me makes no sense. But that will mean not only getting some of the equipment vendors to realize it's in the long-term policy goals for the country to kind of put them in a more competitive field, but it also means getting that fire department or police department radio engineer to recognize that, same old of the last 20 years, doesn't make as much sense in this more kind of vibrant marketplace. Now, clearly, if you're going to have, and devices is going to be easier than the spectrum issue. But having the notion that, devices that can be used, that can migrate from the public safety side to the commercial side and vice versa, I think it's just kind of, incumbent resistant to change. But this is I know this is religion to some folks within the public safety community, and I think, what we've got to do, and what I would, again, if you think this is a issue that makes sense, because if we're going to, at the rate of speed that we're moving now in terms of common standards and public safety interoperability, it will be, the 25th anniversary of 9/11 before we see that compatibility that we all look for. This ought to be a much higher national priority. I think that if you ask most of my colleagues, they would be stunned to realize that that public safety interoperability is still not present. And this is one of those issues where the industry itself, and I would even urge the successful incumbent manufacturers, we ought to do this for the country. This doesn't make any sense that we still have this lack. Well, a lot of stuff in front of us. I know that the really cool panel is going to come next. I would urge you all. And again, I acknowledge at the front end that I'm still kind of behind where the cutting edge on all this stuff is, but it really is important that as an industry, you get in front of me and my colleagues. If you accept, or at least part of my initial premise, that if you strip away kind of economic growth in the last decade, in terms of innovation, we have been anemic at best in America. And if we're looking for the real potential wins over the next decade, energy may be a space. I still think there's enormous opportunities in healthcare, but there's nothing that is as kind of right there on the cusp as mobile broadband. And if we can get the growth rates and while the apps are out there, we can get the growth rates that we saw in wireline internet or in just traditional mobility that we saw in the early 90s, think about the $2 trillion in added economic value to our domestic economy that took place in the 90s. Now, it may not completely equate, but if we're looking for building blocks for the next decade, this should be at the forefront of that. And you've got to help the policymakers and my colleagues, and if there's ever an area that ought to be bipartisan, it ought to be this space. And you got to help the policymakers make sure that these bills, which appropriately were asked by the press, well, if there's such low-hanging fruit, why can't you all get your act together and make these things pass? You've got to help educate all of my colleagues that this is the kind of stuff that we've got to get right to make sure that we can then get the spectrum released, get the devices in place that will allow this kind of growth to take place. Again, Rob, thank you, and thank everybody for my time.